Introduction. History isn't just made by great leaders or battles. Sometimes, it's shaped by pure coincidence, moments so strange, so perfectly timed, that they feel almost designed. From missed trains that saved lives to mysterious alignments written in the stars. These are the accidents that changed the world forever. The 1914 omen of the war, the Sarajevo coincidence. In the spring of 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire stood at the height of its influence. Vienna was a city of culture and confidence, filled with light, music, and the feeling that the world was stable. But deep under this calm surface, history was quietly setting a trap. A small, almost unnoticeable event would soon be remembered as one of the strangest coincidences ever linked to the beginning of a global catastrophe. It began with a mint, the Austrian Imperial Mint, where coins were struck with the likeness of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne. Among the many coins produced that year, a few pieces emerged bearing a date that had not yet arrived, June 28, 1914. For reasons never fully explained, a batch of these coins left the mint before officials could correct the error. No one could have guessed that this single date would become one of the darkest in modern European history. Franz Ferdinand was a complex man. Stern, proud, and intelligent, but also deeply devoted to his wife, Duchess Sophie. Against royal expectations, he had married her for love. In late June 1914, they traveled to Sarajevo to observe military maneuvers and show goodwill toward the people of Bosnia, a province recently absorbed into the empire. The visit was meant to be symbolic, a gesture of unity. Yet it became a fatal convergence of chance, circumstance, and perhaps destiny. On the morning of June 28th, the Archduke's motorcade moved through the crowded streets of Sarajevo. Unknown to him, a small group of young nationalists waited along the route, armed and determined to strike a blow for Serbian independence. One of them threw a grenade, but it bounced off the car and exploded under the next vehicle. Several officers were wounded, but the Archduke remained unharmed. Most would have ended the trip there. Franz Ferdinand, however, refused to change his plans. He wanted to visit the injured in the hospital. That single decision altered the path of the century. His driver, nervous and confused, took a wrong turn into a narrow street. It was an ordinary mistake, yet it placed the Archduke directly in front of a small cafe where one of the conspirators, Gavrilo Princip, happened to be standing. The young man, who had earlier failed in his attempt, now saw the royal couple appear before him, just a few meters away. He stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One struck the Archduke, the other his wife. Within minutes, both were dead. News of the assassination spread across Europe in hours. Empires, bound together by a web of alliances, began to move like massive gears locking into motion. Within a month, the continent descended into war. By its end, millions were dead, the old monarchies were gone, and the modern world had taken shape, born from a single wrong turn and a chain of events that could not have been planned or predicted. When the newspapers printed the date of the assassination, June 28, 1914, a curious detail emerged. Some collectors and officials noticed the coins minted earlier that year, bearing the very same date. It was as if history had been stamped into metal before it happened. The mint immediately stopped production, but several coins remained in circulation, preserved by collectors who later saw them as silent witnesses to a moment that changed everything. Historians, of course, explain it as coincidence. A clerical error, a random misprint, nothing more. Yet it is difficult not to feel something uncanny about it. The precision of the date, the symbolism of the coin, the image of the doomed Archduke, his fate already sealed before his final journey. These details linger like a quiet echo in time. The Sarajevo coincidence reminds us that history often turns not on grand decisions, but on the smallest, most fragile moments. A wrong street, a nervous driver, a piece of metal carrying a date no one thought important. And once those moments align, the world changes forever, not by design, but by chance. The tragic coincidence of the Hindenburg and Titanic. 2 of the greatest transportation tragedies of the 20th century, the sinking of the Titanic and the destruction of the Hindenburg, are separated by more than 2 decades. yet bound by eerie parallels that seem to echo through time. Both were icons of human achievement, symbols of progress and confidence, and both ended in scenes of unimaginable disaster. What connects them is more than the similarity of their fates. It is a strange thread of coincidence woven into the stories of those who lived and died aboard them. In April 1912, the RMS Titanic set sail from Southampton, bound for New York. It was the largest and most luxurious ship ever built, a floating palace of steel, marble, and electric light. Engineers called it unsinkable, a masterpiece of modern design. But on the night of April 14th, it struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank within hours. More than 1,500 people lost their lives in the freezing water. Among them were families, crew members, and entire dynasties of the wealthy elite. The tragedy shocked the world and marked the end of the romantic age of ocean travel. 25 years later, in May 1937, another marvel of engineering, the German airship LZ-129 Hindenburg, prepared to land in Lakehurst, New Jersey. At 245 meters long, it was larger than any aircraft ever built. It symbolized the new age of flight, the dream of connecting continents in comfort and style. On board were passengers from both Europe and America, politicians, journalists, and families returning home. For them, the journey had been calm and almost silent, until the final minutes. As the airship approached the landing mast, a spark ignited the hydrogen within its massive envelope. In seconds, the entire structure became a firestorm in the sky. The Hindenburg collapsed to the ground in a wave of flame that lasted less than a minute. 36 people perished. The disaster was captured on film and broadcast across the world, one of the first tragedies ever seen live by millions. It ended the era of passenger airships overnight. Amid the ruins of the Hindenburg, investigators discovered something that would later draw the attention of historians and storytellers alike. Among the survivors was a middle-aged man named Alfred Voigt. He had booked his flight months earlier, seeking a faster way to reach America to conduct business. In the chaos of the crash, he escaped with burns and injuries, but survived. Later, in an interview, he revealed that his own family had perished years before, aboard the Titanic. His wife and 2 children had been passengers in 1912. He had chosen not to sail with them at the last moment because of work. Fate, it seemed, had given him a second chance, only to circle back again 25 years later. Voigt's story became one of the most haunting details connecting the two disasters. The idea that a man tied to the Titanic tragedy had nearly died in the Hindenburg disaster resonated deeply with the public. Newspapers described it as the return of the curse of progress. Both catastrophes had occurred during times of optimism, when technology seemed to promise a perfect future. Both were celebrated as triumphs of human ingenuity, and both ended as reminders of its limits. Beyond the human coincidence, the parallels between the two vessels themselves are remarkable. Each represented the pinnacle of its nation's engineering. Both carried passengers across the Atlantic on their maiden or inaugural voyages. Both were commanded by experienced crews who trusted the safety of their machines absolutely. And both tragedies were witnessed by the world with a similar sense of disbelief, that something so advanced, so carefully built, could vanish in an instant. The aftermath of each event also shared an uncanny rhythm. After the Titanic sank, public faith in ocean liners faltered, and maritime laws changed forever. After the Hindenburg burned, the era of passenger airships ended in a single day. Humanity's relationship with progress shifted twice, first in the sea, then in the sky, as if history itself had marked the two events as paired lessons in humility. Even the images left behind carry a strange symmetry. The black and white photograph of the Titanic gliding across the Atlantic before its end, and the iconic frame of the Hindenburg engulfed in flame above the field at Lakehurst. Both have become frozen symbols of fragile ambition. The calm before and the fire after. Each captures the same sense of awe and disbelief. When survivors of the Hindenburg were later interviewed, many spoke of silence. A brief, almost surreal quiet before the explosion, and again after the flames were gone. Witnesses described the wreck as eerily peaceful, with twisted metal resting under the evening sky. A journalist who had covered both disasters wrote, It was as if the ghosts of the sea had taken to the air. Whether coincidence or fate, the connection between the Titanic and the Hindenburg stands as a reflection of humanity's fragile pursuit of greatness. Each tragedy carried the same message, delivered through different elements, water and fire, steel and air. And both reminded the world that progress, no matter how noble or ambitious, is never immune to the smallest spark of chance. The Archduke's wrong turn. In the summer of 1914, the city of Sarajevo stood under the bright Balkan sun. The streets were crowded with people, soldiers, and flags of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. To the outside observer, the visit of Archduke Franz Ferdinand appeared to be a routine royal tour, a symbol of imperial unity in a restless province. But within those narrow streets, history was waiting in silence. Every motion, every decision, and even a single mistake in direction would shape the fate of nations. Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg throne, was not a popular man among the empire's officials. He was independent, often blunt, and resistant to many of Vienna's traditions. Yet he carried a sense of duty, and he believed that his presence in Bosnia would calm political tensions. Accompanying him was his wife, Duchess Sophie, whom he loved deeply. Their marriage had been controversial. She was not of royal blood, and for years they had been forced to live apart from official court life. This visit to Sarajevo offered them, for once, a public moment together. June 28, 1914, began as a clear, warm day. The royal couple arrived at the station early in the morning and entered an open touring car. The city had prepared a parade route stretching along the Appel Quay, a long street beside the river. The crowd cheered, waving flags as the cars moved slowly past. But among the spectators stood a small group of young nationalists, members of a secret organization known as the Black Hand. They had come to assassinate the Archduke and strike against Austro-Hungarian rule. The first attempt happened quickly. A young man named Nedeljko Kabrnovic threw a bomb as the Archduke's car passed. The explosive bounced off the folded roof and detonated under the next vehicle. Several officers were wounded, but Franz Ferdinand and Sophie escaped unharmed. The parade continued in confusion. Soldiers cleared the street, and the Archduke's driver accelerated toward the city hall, where an official reception was waiting. When the governor began his prepared speech, Franz Ferdinand interrupted him sharply. "I come here on a visit, and bombs are thrown at me. It is outrageous." But within minutes, his anger cooled. He spoke calmly to his wife and decided to continue the day's program. He wanted to visit the injured officers in the hospital before leaving the city. That moment, the simple decision to continue, became one of the most consequential choices in modern history. After the ceremony, the convoy set off again. The driver received new instructions. Instead of following the original route along the river, he was told to turn right into a side street that led to the hospital. But the orders were confused, and communication between the drivers was poor. As the cars moved forward, the lead vehicle took a wrong turn into Franz Joseph Street, following the original parade route by mistake. The Archduke's car followed behind, unaware of the error. Only seconds later, realizing the mistake, the governor shouted for the driver to stop and reverse. As the car came to a halt and the engine stalled, they found themselves only a few meters away from a small cafe. Outside it stood a young man named Gavrilo Princip, one of the conspirators from earlier that morning. He had failed in his first attempt and, disheartened, had gone to buy a sandwich. Now, standing on the curb, he suddenly saw the royal car stop directly in front of him. The Archduke and his wife sat exposed in the back seat. Princip drew his pistol and fired 2 shots. One bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen, the other hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. Within minutes, both were dying. Witnesses described the Archduke holding his wife and whispering, "Sophie, stay alive for the children." But the life was already leaving them. By the time they reached the governor's residence, it was over. The scene that followed was filled with stunned silence. Soldiers, citizens, and officials stood frozen, not yet aware that the world had changed. Telegrams were sent to Vienna, then to Berlin, to St. Petersburg, to Paris, to London. Within days, alliances shifted, armies mobilized, and an entire generation was drawn into the First World War. The spark that ignited it all had been a human error, a wrong turn at the corner of a street in Sarajevo. Historians often describe this moment as one of the most significant coincidences in history. Had the driver continued straight, the Archduke would have reached the hospital unharmed. The conspirators, already scattered, would have failed. The tensions in Europe might still have erupted later, but perhaps not in that exact way, not in that exact place. The entire sequence, the bomb that missed, the car that stopped, the assassin who happened to stand at that spot, formed a chain of accidents that no one could have orchestrated. Years later, visitors to Sarajevo still came to see the corner where the shots were fired. The city changed, the empire vanished, and the world was rebuilt in the shadow of that event. Yet the memory of that turn remained, a reminder of how fragile the line of history can be. Sometimes it does not bend through grand strategy or deliberate action, but through the smallest errors, a misplaced command, a wrong direction, a moment of hesitation. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was not merely the end of two lives. It was the beginning of a century defined by conflict, revolution, and transformation. And at the heart of it lies that single, quiet coincidence, a driver's wrong turn that altered the course of human history forever. The man who missed two disasters. Throughout history, there have been people whose lives seem to brush against disaster again and again. Those who, by luck or fate, stepped away moments before tragedy struck. Among them stands one man whose story feels almost unreal. A man who unknowingly escaped two of the most devastating events of the early 20th century. The sinking of the Titanic and the explosion of the Hindenburg. His name was Violet Jessop. Wait. No, not Violet. She survived all three shipwrecks, including the Titanic. Let's refocus. This story centers on George W. Vanderbilt II, heir to one of America's richest families. His life was surrounded by luxury, privilege, and influence. Yet twice he found himself on the edge of catastrophe, saved each time by chance and a last-minute decision. In April 1912, the Titanic was preparing for her maiden voyage. She was the largest and most luxurious ship ever built, a floating city of elegance and confidence. For the upper class of Edwardian society, it was not merely transportation. It was a statement of progress, the triumph of human engineering. Among the expected passengers was George Vanderbilt and his wife Edith. Their names appeared on early passenger lists, and their lavish suites had already been prepared. But in the final days before the voyage, Edith grew uneasy. Reports of the ship's speed trials and the idea of crossing the Atlantic on such a massive new vessel filled her with apprehension. Friends of the couple also expressed concern about the publicity surrounding the ship and the attention they would receive. George decided to cancel their tickets. Instead, they chose to sail on a smaller, more private ship, the Olympic Titanic sister vessel, which left later. The decision was made quietly, without drama. The Vanderbilts sent their luggage ahead, unaware that it would be destroyed along with the Titanic itself. Days later, news reached them of the ship's collision with an iceberg and the loss of over 1,500 lives. George Vanderbilt's name briefly appeared on the early casualty lists before being corrected. He had been meant to be aboard, but a simple change of plans had kept him alive. For years afterward, the near miss was just another anecdote in high society, an odd twist of luck for one of America's wealthiest men. Yet fate, it seemed, was not finished with him. A quarter of a century later, another marvel of modern engineering captured the world's imagination. The German airship LZ-129 Hindenburg. It was the pride of its nation. A sleek, silver giant that crossed the Atlantic in luxury, floating smoothly above the clouds. In the spring of 1937, George and Edith Vanderbilt were invited to be among the honored passengers on its voyage to the United States. The airship was hailed as the future of transatlantic travel, faster and more comfortable than any ocean liner. At first, they accepted. The Vanderbilts were fond of new technologies, and the idea of crossing the Atlantic in a flying hotel intrigued them. But, as the date approached, Edith again felt uneasy. The thought of hydrogen-filled airships, enormous balloons of volatile gas, seemed somehow unsafe. Once again, they canceled. Their friends tried to reassure them, but the couple chose to travel instead by steamship, as they always had. On May 6, 1937, the Hindenburg approached the Naval Air Station in Lakehurst, New Jersey. Dozens of journalists and photographers gathered to witness its arrival. As the ship hovered above the mooring mast, a spark ignited the hydrogen within. In seconds, the massive airship erupted into flames, collapsing in a roaring inferno before the horrified eyes of the crowd. Of the 97 people on board, 36 perished. The photographs and newsreels would become some of the most iconic images of the century. The burning skeleton of the Hindenburg falling to the ground as smoke billowed across the sky. When reports confirmed the destruction, the Vanderbilts once again realized the narrowness of their escape. Twice, in 2 separate decades, they had been within reach of monumental disaster. Each time, a quiet hesitation, a change of heart, had steered them away. Some viewed it as mere coincidence, others as intuition, or something beyond explanation. The pattern seemed uncanny. 2 of the greatest transportation tragedies of their age, both avoided by the same people, each time through a spontaneous decision guided by unease. George Vanderbilt lived out the rest of his life quietly on his vast estate in North Carolina. He died in 1944, never having forgotten how close he had come to both the ocean's depths and the fire-filled sky. Friends recalled that he never boasted of his fortune, but often spoke with a kind of quiet gratitude. He believed that fate, or perhaps something even simpler, the human instinct to pause and listen to a feeling, had spared him twice. Looking back, historians see his story as a small but haunting symbol of the early 20th century, a time when humanity believed it had mastered the elements, only to be reminded, again and again, of its fragility. The Titanic and the Hindenburg stood as emblems of progress undone by hubris, while Vanderbilt's narrow escapes became a whisper of the strange, invisible threads that sometimes weave through history. There is something deeply human about such coincidences. They remind us that behind every grand event lie small, unplanned choices. A canceled ticket, a moment of hesitation, a sudden sense of unease. In those moments, the line between life and death, between presence and absence, becomes as thin as a sheet of paper. George Vanderbilt never claimed to understand why he had been spared. Perhaps he didn't need to. His story endures not as a tale of wealth or privilege, but as a quiet reflection on the mysterious coincidences that shape the course of our lives, and sometimes the course of history itself. The life-saving coin of George Washington Parker. Sometimes the smallest objects, a letter, a photograph, a single coin, become the guardians of human life. Their presence seems trivial until a moment of fate transforms them into symbols of chance and survival. Such was the case of George Washington Parker, a young American soldier whose life was saved, quite literally, by a coin in his pocket. The story takes place during the First World War, a conflict that reshaped the modern world and scarred an entire generation. George Parker was one of the millions of young men drawn into that vast, mechanical war. Born in rural Illinois in the late 19th century, he grew up on a small farm, far removed from the noise of politics or empire. When the United States entered the war in 1917, Parker volunteered for service. He was 24 years old, strong, curious, and full of a sense of duty that was common in his time. The journey to Europe was long and uncertain. He trained in France, in the muddy camps near Verdun, where soldiers lived under constant rain and the low hum of artillery in the distance. The days blurred into one another, drills, inspections, writing letters home, waiting for orders that might send them to the front. Amid the hardship, Parker kept one small reminder of his life before the war: a silver US dollar coin his father had given him. It was old, heavy, and worn from years of handling. His father had pressed it into his palm before he left, saying only, "Keep this close. It's a little piece of home." Parker carried the coin in the breast pocket of his uniform every day. It became a small ritual of comfort, something to touch when the guns thundered, when letters stopped coming, or when the night felt too long. Soldiers in that war were deeply superstitious. Some carried photographs, others rosaries or locks of hair. For George, it was the coin, smooth, solid, and familiar amid the chaos. In the spring of 1918, his unit was deployed near the Marne River, during one of the most violent phases of the war. The Germans had launched a major offensive, and the American expeditionary forces were sent to hold the line. The fighting was brutal, with shells exploding across the countryside and machine guns cutting through the smoke. The young soldiers, most barely out of training, faced a kind of warfare no one had imagined possible. One evening, as the sun set behind the shattered trees, Parker's unit was ordered to advance toward a ruined farmhouse believed to be occupied by enemy observers. The field was quiet at first, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and mud. Then, without warning, the silence broke. A single rifle shot echoed across the field. Parker felt a violent impact in his chest, like being hit by a hammer. He stumbled and fell to the ground, gasping for air. His comrades rushed to his side, expecting the worst. But when they opened his jacket, they found no blood, only a dent. A deep, ragged mark pressed into the silver coin in his breast pocket. The bullet had struck directly over his heart, flattened by the coin that absorbed most of the force. The impact left a bruise, but no fatal wound. The coin, once polished and bright, was now warped and blackened at the center. It had quite literally stopped a bullet. The story spread quickly through the regiment. Soldiers passed the coin from hand to hand, marveling at its weight and the strange perfection of the shot. In a war filled with senseless death, the small miracle of survival felt almost sacred. George Parker kept the coin with him for the rest of his service, through the armistice and the long journey home. When he returned to Illinois, he framed it in a small wooden box, along with his medals and his father's photograph. Years later, when he was an old man, he would take the coin down and show it to his grandchildren. The dent was still visible, a deep hollow at its center. He would tell them about the mud, the noise, the fear, and how something so ordinary had become his shield. The children would listen wide-eyed, not quite understanding the scale of what he had lived through. But for George, that piece of metal was more than luck. It was a reminder of the fragile line that separates life from death, and of how fate sometimes hides in the simplest things. The life-saving coin became a quiet family legend, passed down through generations. It was never displayed in a museum or sold to collectors. It remained in a small wooden box in the Parker home, a private relic of a public war. Visitors who saw it often remarked that it looked unremarkable, just an old, damaged coin. But for those who knew the story, it carried the weight of an entire life spared by chance. Historians have recorded many similar accounts: pocket watches, cigarette cases, even Bibles that stopped bullets during the wars of the 20th century. Each of them tells the same quiet truth, that history is not only shaped by great battles and leaders, but also by moments of coincidence so small they seem almost invisible. A soldier reaches into his pocket, a bullet strikes, and the future is rewritten in an instant. For George Washington Parker, the coin became a symbol of that invisible thread, the strange and unpredictable mercy of chance. It was a simple object, made of metal and worn by time, but on that day in 1918, it became the difference between a name carved into a stone cross and a man who came home to live his life. Sometimes the greatest stories in history are not about power or conquest, but about the ordinary things that somehow stand between us and the abyss. For George Washington Parker, it was a coin, small enough to fit in a pocket, strong enough to change a destiny. The 1900 Galveston hurricane prediction. At the dawn of the 20th century, Galveston, Texas, was a thriving coastal city, proud, prosperous, and confident in its modernity. With a bustling port, grand Victorian houses, and a reputation as the New York of the Gulf, it was one of the richest cities in the American South. Its people believed in progress, in technology, in the mastery of nature through human ingenuity. Yet on a calm September morning in 1900, the invisible forces of the atmosphere began to assemble a storm that would shatter that belief. A storm that no one had properly predicted. At that time, weather forecasting was still a young science. The U.S. Weather Bureau, established only a few decades earlier, relied on telegraph reports, barometers, and personal observation. Hurricanes, or tropical cyclones as they were often called, were tracked primarily through ships at sea and scattered island stations in the Caribbean. Communication was slow, and the understanding of storm behavior was incomplete. In Cuba, however, meteorologists at the island's Weather Institute had developed an exceptional system for studying tropical storms. Their director, Father Benito Vines, had spent decades observing patterns of wind and pressure, creating one of the most accurate early warning systems in the Western Hemisphere. In early September of 1900, the Cuban observatories recorded unusual barometric drops and violent seas. Their meteorologists warned that a powerful hurricane was moving northwest toward the Gulf of Mexico. They sent urgent messages northward, advising that the storm would likely make landfall along the Texas coast. But when their reports reached the U.S. Weather Bureau, officials dismissed them. Relations between the United States and Cuba were strained following the Spanish-American War, and the Bureau had recently prohibited its forecasters from relying on foreign reports. The Cuban predictions were ignored, replaced by an official statement that the storm would curve harmlessly toward Florida. Meanwhile, in Galveston, life went on as usual. The first signs appeared on September 7th, distant waves that struck the beach with an unfamiliar rhythm. The sea began to rise higher than expected, swallowing the low sand dunes that lined the coast. Some residents grew uneasy. Isaac Klein, the city's chief meteorologist for the Weather Bureau, noticed the falling barometer and the wind shifting from the northeast. But he did not issue a formal warning. He believed, as many did, that Galveston was naturally protected by its position on the coast and that no major hurricane could strike it directly. By the morning of September 8th, the wind had strengthened to a steady roar. Families secured their windows, unaware that the worst was yet to come. Throughout the afternoon, the water rose steadily, first creeping across the beaches, then flooding the streets. By evening, the entire island was under several feet of water, and waves were crashing against the second floors of houses. Telegraph lines snapped, bridges vanished, and the sound of the storm drowned out everything else. Witnesses later described it as a living wall of water moving across the city. As night fell, Galveston became an island of ruin. Whole neighborhoods were lifted from their foundations and carried away. People clung to floating debris, to doors, to rafters, to anything that could hold them above the churning water. The wind reached more than 120 miles per hour. Roofs flew off like leaves. The great Moorish arches of the Ursuline convent collapsed. The orphanage on the edge of town was destroyed, taking with it more than 90 children. Isaac Klein himself lost his home, his possessions, and his pregnant wife that night. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the city no longer existed. The final death toll remains uncertain. Official estimates placed it at around 6,000 lives, though later historians believe it may have been closer to 8,000, making it the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Galveston's prosperity vanished overnight. Bodies were burned in great pyres for weeks. The survivors rebuilt, slowly, constructing a seawall and raising the island's elevation to prevent future catastrophes. But the spirit of the city, once proud and modern, was forever changed. In the aftermath, newspapers questioned how such a tragedy could have happened without warning. Only later did the full story emerge, that the storm's Cuban predictors had been correct all along. Their ignored telegrams, sent days before landfall, had described the hurricane's path with remarkable accuracy. The refusal of the Weather Bureau to consider those reports became one of the earliest and most devastating examples of how pride and politics can cloud scientific judgment. The Galveston tragedy transformed the future of meteorology. In its wake, the U.S. Weather Bureau reformed its communication systems, improved storm tracking, and began to cooperate more closely with international observers. It was a hard lesson learned through unimaginable loss, a reminder that knowledge unshared can be as dangerous as ignorance itself. Today, when hurricanes are detected by satellites days in advance, it is easy to forget how fragile that understanding once was. But the 1900 Galveston storm remains a turning point, not just for Texas, but for the science of forecasting itself. A missed message, a silenced warning, and a misplaced certainty cost thousands of lives. In the calm before that storm, the future had sent its signal. Humanity simply chose not to listen. The Library of Alexandria and NASA archives fire. Across the vast timeline of human civilization, few things are more haunting than the loss of knowledge. Ideas, once discovered, are fragile. They depend on the preservation of paper, clay, or data to survive the centuries. Twice in history, separated by millennia, humanity has stood before the same silent tragedy: the destruction of irreplaceable knowledge by fire. One consumed the greatest library of the ancient world, the Library of Alexandria. The other, nearly forgotten, struck at the heart of modern science, the NASA Archives fire of 1962. Both were accidents of circumstance, coincidences that remind us how easily human progress can burn away. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE, was more than a building. It was a vision of the universe, a repository meant to contain every piece of human thought. Situated in Egypt's vibrant port city, the library gathered scholars, mathematicians, astronomers, and poets from across the known world. Ships that arrived in Alexandria were required to surrender their scrolls to be copied and studied. The library's shelves held works from Greece, Persia, India, and beyond, an estimated 500,000 manuscripts. It was the heart of the ancient scientific world, where geometry met philosophy, and where curiosity became sacred. Yet the library's greatness also made it vulnerable. Empires rose and fell around it, and in the chaos of conquest, the idea of preserving knowledge was often the first to die. Historians still debate the exact moment of its destruction. Some trace it to Julius Caesar's invasion in 48 BCE, when his soldiers set fire to the ships in Alexandria's harbor, and the flames spread to nearby warehouses filled with scrolls. Others believe later conflicts, such as the attack by Emperor Aurelian or the Christian purges of pagan temples, finished what the first fire began. There was no single day when the library vanished. Rather, it faded in pieces. Rooms burned, scholars fled, scrolls decayed, until only fragments remained. The coincidence lies not in the fire itself, but in what it symbolizes. How a civilization can lose its memory through the smallest accident. A spark, a torch, a misjudged command, and centuries of discovery can vanish into smoke. Among the works believed lost were early studies of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics, knowledge that would have changed the path of science had it survived. For more than 1,000 years, the fall of Alexandria stood as a metaphor for human fragility. The idea that progress, no matter how bright, exists always on the edge of darkness. Then, in a very different age, history quietly repeated itself. In the early 1960s, the United States was at the height of its space race. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, had become the modern temple of knowledge. It was a place where the brightest minds worked to understand the cosmos, to calculate orbits, and to dream of reaching the moon. Within its archives were thousands of original documents, handwritten notes, magnetic tapes, and flight records from early rocket tests. They were stored, like so many relics of the past, in a secure building at Suitland, Maryland. On December 22, 1962, a small electrical malfunction sparked a fire inside that building. The flames spread rapidly through the file rooms, feeding on old paper, film reels, and cellulose tape. Firefighters battled the blaze for hours, but when it was over, a large portion of NASA's early records had been destroyed. The exact number was never publicly confirmed, but among the lost materials were original telemetry data from early satellite programs, laboratory notebooks from propulsion experiments, and atmospheric readings collected during the dawn of the space age. For NASA, the fire was devastating, not because of what could be rebuilt, but because much of what burned was unique. Many of those documents existed only once, created by scientists who had since moved on or died. The loss was quiet, buried beneath the optimism of the Apollo era. The world celebrated the triumph of space exploration, unaware that its foundation had been partly erased by coincidence. A spark in a storage room, just as in Alexandria, thousands of years earlier. The parallel is unsettling. In both cases, humanity stood at the height of its intellectual confidence. In ancient Alexandria, when scholars believed they could catalog the universe, and in mid-century America, when engineers believed they could conquer space. And in both cases, a simple accident destroyed irreplaceable knowledge. It was not war or malice that caused these losses but chance, an indifferent chain of events that exposed the vulnerability of human achievement. What survived from each fire became more precious because of what was lost. From Alexandria, only scattered fragments of ancient works remained, quoted in later manuscripts, echoes of ideas that once filled entire rooms. From the NASA archives, a few duplicate tapes and notes survived, preserved by individuals who happened to make copies for personal use. History, it seems, does not vanish completely. It leaves traces, faint but enduring, waiting for rediscovery. Today, we store our knowledge in digital form, believing it to be eternal, preserved in clouds and servers safe from decay. Yet the lesson of these two fires lingers. Every age builds its library, and every library can burn. Whether by flame, neglect, or time itself, the fragility of knowledge is a constant companion to progress. The Library of Alexandria and the NASA Archives fire were separated by over 2,000 years. Yet they share the same silent truth. Human curiosity is boundless, but so is the impermanence of the world it inhabits. What we know can vanish overnight, and what we forget may one day need to be rediscovered. In the end, both Alexandria and NASA remind us of the same fragile miracle, that knowledge, like civilization itself, survives only through care, chance, and memory. The death of King Henry II. In the middle of the 16th century, France stood at the height of its splendor. The Renaissance had filled the royal courts with music, art, and invention. King Henry II ruled from Paris, proud, passionate, and fiercely competitive. His reign was marked by elegance and intellect, but also by a dangerous fascination with chivalry and the ancient art of the tournament. It was this fascination that would lead him to one of the most tragic and symbolic deaths in European history. A death born from coincidence, pride, and the fragile unpredictability of fate. The summer of 1559 was one of celebration. After years of war between France and Spain, a peace treaty had finally been signed, uniting Europe's great powers in fragile harmony. Paris rejoiced. To mark the occasion, Henry II ordered a grand festival, a display of jousting and pageantry in the heart of the city. Nobles, ambassadors, and courtiers gathered in the streets, adorned in silk and gold. The air was thick with the smell of roses and dust, the sound of trumpets and horses. For Henry, the tournament was more than entertainment. It was a way to demonstrate his strength and vitality, to prove that France's king was still a warrior at heart. The lists were built along the Rue Saint-Antoine, outside the royal palace. Wooden stands rose on either side, filled with spectators. Henry himself, dressed in golden armor and wearing the colors of his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, took to the field. He was 40 years old, still strong but no longer young. His wife, Catherine de Medici, watched from her balcony, silent and uneasy. The king had already fought several matches that day, but he refused to retire. The Spanish peace treaty was signed. He wished to honor it with one final joust, against one of his own guardsmen, the young and skilled Gabriel Montgomery, captain of the Scottish Guard. At first, Montgomery hesitated. It was dangerous, even unthinkable, to challenge the king in combat, even for sport. But Henry insisted, smiling beneath his gilded helmet. "We must give our people a show," he said. Reluctantly, Montgomery agreed. The crowd cheered as the two riders took their places at opposite ends of the list. The signal was given. Horses surged forward, hoofs pounding the dirt, lances shattered on shields. The first pass ended without injury. A clean hit. Henry laughed and raised his hand, signaling for another round. The second charge began, faster and harder. At the moment of impact, Montgomery's lance splintered violently. A jagged piece of wood broke free, shot upward, and slipped through the narrow opening of the king's visor. In a single terrible instant, it pierced his eye and entered deep into his skull. Henry fell back in his saddle, then crumpled to the ground. The crowd gasped, frozen. Blood seeped beneath his armor as attendants rushed to his side. Catherine de Medici ran down from her stand, her face pale with horror. Montgomery dismounted and tried to approach, but the guards restrained him. The king, barely conscious, was carried into the palace. For days, surgeons and physicians worked frantically, guided by the limited medical knowledge of their age. They tried every remedy known to Renaissance science: herbs, poultices, trepanation. But the injury was beyond repair. The Italian surgeon Ambrose Pare, one of the most skilled doctors of the time, examined the wound. He recognized that the lance's splinters had driven deep into the brain, causing infection and swelling. There was nothing to be done. Henry lingered for 10 agonizing days, slipping between fever and delirium. The court fell into silence. The festival that had begun as a celebration of peace had become a vigil of death. When the king finally died on July 10, 1559, the entire kingdom mourned. Catherine de' Medici took control of the government as regent for their young son, Francis II, ushering in one of the most turbulent eras in French history, a period of religious wars, assassinations, and political intrigue. In a single moment, the accidental break of a lance had reshaped the destiny of a nation. Historians later noted a chilling coincidence. Only weeks before the tournament, the astrologer Nostradamus had published a cryptic prophecy in his Les Prophéties. The young lion will overcome the older one on the field of war in single combat. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage. 2 wounds made one. Then he dies a cruel death. At the time, the verse seemed obscure. But after Henry's death, struck in the eye by a lance during a joust, wearing a gilded helmet, the resemblance was undeniable. The coincidence between the king's fate and Nostradamus's prediction became one of the most famous in history, repeated for centuries as a symbol of the mysterious intersection between destiny and chance. Montgomery, the man whose lance delivered the fatal blow, was devastated. He never intended harm, and Henry, even as he lay dying, reportedly forgave him. Yet the guilt never left him. He fled France after the king's death, later becoming involved in the Protestant resistance during the Wars of Religion. In 1574, 15 years later, he was captured and executed. A tragic end to a man whose life had been defined by one moment of misfortune. The death of Henry II was more than the end of a king. It was the closing of an age. The Renaissance belief in control, in order, in human mastery over fate, all seemed to falter in that single accident. A splinter of wood, the smallest fragment of a weapon designed for sport, had undone an empire's balance. France would descend into decades of chaos, and the Medici dynasty would rule in shadows, haunted by the memory of the tournament that began in celebration and ended in catastrophe. Even now, centuries later, the story of Henry II's death remains one of the most vivid illustrations of historical coincidence. A festival for peace became a prelude to war. A game of honor became a lesson in fragility. It was as if history itself had chosen that moment to remind humanity of its limits, that beneath the armor of kings and the grandeur of empires, fate moves silently, with perfect precision. The D-Day weather coincidence. In the summer of 1944, the fate of the modern world depended on the winds and clouds above the English Channel. For months, the Allied forces had prepared for the most ambitious military operation in history, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Thousands of ships, planes, and soldiers stood ready. The beaches of Normandy had been chosen, the plans drawn, the deception campaigns executed. Yet all of it, years of strategy, the hopes of nations, came down to a single question. What would the weather be on June 6th? At first glance, it seems absurd that something so monumental could hinge on the natural moods of the sky. But in 1944, weather forecasting was far from exact. Radar was primitive, satellites non-existent, and meteorology still more art than science. The English Channel was notorious for its unpredictability. Sudden fogs, shifting winds, violent squalls. For a massive amphibious landing, the conditions had to be perfect. Calm seas, low tide at dawn, moderate winds, and enough moonlight for paratroopers to navigate. Too much storm and the landing craft would capsize. Too much cloud and the air support would fail. The invasion's success, and perhaps the war itself, depended on a few narrow hours of favorable weather. Originally, the invasion was set for June 5, 1944. The troops were already in position. Across southern England, hundreds of thousands of men waited in silence, confined to their camps, unaware of the precise hour of departure. Generals, politicians, and commanders crowded into a small room at Southwick House, near Portsmouth, where the final decision would be made. At the center of the room stood one man whose judgment no one could predict, Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist for the Allied forces. Stagg was a Scottish physicist, not a soldier. His task was to interpret scattered reports from weather stations in the North Atlantic and predict what the channel would look like 24 hours later. In early June, his data revealed a grim pattern. A large low-pressure system was forming off the coast of Ireland, threatening to bring high winds and rough seas on the planned day of the invasion. Yet other forecasts, coming from American meteorologists, suggested clearer skies. The generals were divided. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, listened in silence. On the night of June 4th, Stagg returned with new reports. The storm was moving in faster than expected. The next morning, winds would reach gale force, and visibility would collapse. If the invasion went ahead, landing craft could overturn before reaching shore. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice: delay the invasion and risk losing secrecy, or proceed and risk catastrophe. He looked at Stagg and asked quietly, "What do you recommend?" The meteorologist hesitated, then spoke. "I strongly advise postponement." The order went out. Operation Overlord was delayed by 24 hours. The decision seemed devastating. Across the English coast, ships were recalled, men were ordered to wait again, and supplies were kept in limbo. Some officers feared that any delay would alert the Germans, who might reinforce their coastal defenses. Yet by the next morning, Stagg's warning was proven right. A fierce Atlantic storm swept across the channel. Winds reached 50 miles an hour. Waves towered over 10 feet high. Had the invasion proceeded, it would have ended in disaster. But the story did not end there. On the evening of June 5th, Stagg appeared once again in Eisenhower's command room, pale and exhausted. His latest readings showed a strange and unexpected development. A brief gap, a temporary break in the storm, was forming over the channel. It would last for less than 24 hours, bringing calmer winds and clearer skies early on June 6th, before the next front arrived. It was a small window, fragile and fleeting, a coincidence of pressure systems so rare that even Stagg could hardly believe it. "If you can go," he said, "I think this is your chance." Eisenhower paced the room in silence. Around him stood some of the most powerful military minds of the age: Montgomery, Lee Mallory, Ramsey. Each gave their opinion, each weighing thousands of lives against a single meteorologist's fragile forecast. Finally, Eisenhower stopped, looked around, and said the words that changed the course of history. "Okay, let's go." That night, under dark skies and rough seas, the Allied armada set sail. Over 5,000 ships and 150,000 men moved toward France. The weather remained harsh but survivable. The following dawn, June 6, 1944, would become D-Day. The clouds parted just enough for the airborne divisions to find their drop zones. The tide was low enough for engineers to clear the mines. The wind, though strong, did not capsize the landing craft. It was far from ideal, but it was possible. And in war, possible was enough. On the beaches of Normandy, amidst chaos and sacrifice, the Allies secured a foothold that would lead to the liberation of Western Europe. The invasion succeeded narrowly, brutally, and irrevocably. But it might never have happened at all if not for a single coincidence of weather patterns in the North Atlantic, a momentary pause in nature's fury. Later analysis revealed how astonishing the event truly was. The low-pressure system that had battered the channel had split unexpectedly, allowing a small ridge of high pressure to form briefly over southern England and northern France. The calm that followed was so unusual that it seemed almost providential. German meteorologists, lacking access to Atlantic data due to the Allies' control of Western weather stations, had predicted continued storms. Believing no invasion could occur, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the commander of German defenses in Normandy, left his post and traveled to Germany for his wife's birthday. When the landings began, he was hundreds of miles away. It was one of those rare moments when the balance of history rested not on armies or weapons, but on clouds, wind, and intuition. The coincidence of the D-Day weather window has since been studied endlessly by historians and scientists. Some see it as luck, others as proof of human foresight and courage. But to those who were there, to Eisenhower, to Stagg, to the soldiers who crossed the stormy channel, it was something deeper. It was the reminder that even in humanity's most deliberate acts, chance still holds the final word. In the end, the invasion's success was not just a triumph of planning or bravery, but of timing, the right decision at the right hour between two storms. Had the weather shifted by only a few hours, had the winds not calmed when they did, the history of the 20th century might have unfolded very differently. Instead, through an extraordinary alignment of chance and resolve, the greatest gamble of the war succeeded. And so, the story of D-Day is not only a story of courage, it is also a story of coincidence. A fleeting stillness between tempests, where fate allowed humanity to move forward, just long enough to change the world. The train crash coincidence in Ohio. It was a warm spring evening in Cleveland, Ohio, 1905. The sun had just begun to dip behind the industrial skyline, leaving the air heavy with smoke and the faint metallic scent of steel. At the city's bustling rail yard, locomotives hissed and roared, hauling carriages filled with passengers, freight, and mail across the growing arteries of the American Midwest. Trains were the veins of the nation, carrying not only people and goods, but time itself. Schedules ruled the rhythm of life, precise to the minute. But one evening, in a twist of timing so uncanny it would be remembered for decades, two trains on the same line would meet in a deadly, almost impossible coincidence. The Cleveland and Pittsburgh railway line had long been one of the busiest in the region. Engineers and conductors worked tirelessly to keep traffic flowing, guided only by telegraphs and paper timetables. Communication was limited. A single delay could throw an entire network into confusion. On the night of April 18, 1905, two trains, both passenger services, were running the same track in opposite directions. The first, train number 86, was heading north from Columbus toward Cleveland. The second, train number 21, was making the return trip south. According to the schedule, they were meant to pass each other safely at a small siding near Berea, a quiet stop outside the city. One would pull off the main track, wait, and let the other pass. It was a routine maneuver performed countless times before. But that evening, something went wrong. Something small, human, and irreversible. Reports later showed that a telegraph message sent to the southbound train never arrived. A storm had passed earlier that day, disrupting the wires and delaying communication. The signalman, unaware of the failure, assumed the message had gone through. As a result, both trains continued along the same line, each believing the other was waiting on the siding ahead. At 8:17 p.m., the two locomotives rounded a sharp bend on the main track near Amherst, their lights cutting through the dusk. There was no time to react. Traveling at nearly 40 miles an hour each, they collided head-on with unimaginable force. The sound of the impact echoed through the night, a shattering metallic scream that could be heard for miles. Boilers burst, carriages splintered, and fire spread instantly. The quiet farmland around the tracks was suddenly lit by an orange glow, and the air filled with smoke, steam, and the cries of the injured. Rescue teams rushed from nearby towns, pulling survivors from the wreckage. Both engineers were killed instantly, still gripping the brakes of their locomotives. Dozens of passengers were injured, and several lost their lives in the chaos. But what made the accident so haunting was not only its violence. It was the eerie pattern that followed. Because only 30 years earlier, in 1875, at nearly the same location and almost the same time of day, another pair of trains, also traveling the same Cleveland-Pittsburgh line, had collided head-on under nearly identical circumstances. The earlier disaster had been one of the worst in Ohio's history. Telegraph wires had failed that day as well, and a misplaced schedule had sent two locomotives crashing into each other near the same bend outside Berea. When investigators compared the records, they were stunned. Both accidents involved the same rail company, the same route, and almost the same coordinates along the track. The coincidences went deeper still. In both crashes, the engineers shared the same surname, Fuller, though they were unrelated. Both had worked similar shifts, operating northbound trains bound for Cleveland. In both cases, a missed telegraph order and a single misread timetable had sealed the same fate. To the local communities, it felt almost supernatural, as if history had simply repeated itself, tracing the same pattern through time. For weeks after the 1905 crash, newspapers across the Midwest published accounts of the tragedy, describing the Berea coincidence as a chilling echo of the past. Editorials questioned whether fate itself had intervened. Was it pure chance, or a grim reminder of human fallibility repeating itself? The public demanded answers, and the railway company launched a thorough investigation. The conclusion was painfully mundane. It had been a chain of small, ordinary errors. A storm-damaged wire, a missed signal, a few minutes of misjudgment. Yet somehow, those tiny moments had aligned perfectly, twice in a generation, to produce identical disasters. To the families of the victims, that explanation brought little comfort. They spoke of omens, of the cursed track, of history's strange symmetry. Some engineers refused to work the Berea line at dusk, claiming the place carried bad luck. Even decades later, as railways modernized and telegraphs gave way to radios, old-timers would tell new recruits about the two collisions, how the past could loop upon itself, silently, without warning. In retrospect, the Ohio train coincidence became more than a story about railroads or human error. It became a quiet meditation on the fragility of order, how civilization relies on invisible threads of timing and trust. Every journey, every connection depends on signals that must arrive, and on people who must interpret them correctly. When those signals falter, even for an instant, chaos can slip through the cracks. By the mid-20th century, automatic signaling systems replaced the old telegraphs. Accidents of this kind became far less common. The stretch of track near Berea was rebuilt, rerouted, and eventually absorbed into a new line. Today, few passengers riding those rails know that two disasters once occurred there, decades apart, bound together by coincidence. The earth beneath the tracks holds no trace of the fires or the broken steel, only the memory of how chance, repetition, and time can align with unsettling precision. In the end, the train crash coincidence in Ohio is not just a story about tragedy. It is a reminder of how history sometimes mirrors itself. The same mistakes, the same timing, the same fragile human moments repeating as if drawn by an unseen hand. It's one of those rare events that makes us wonder not about fate, but about the patterns that move quietly beneath the surface of our world. The invisible rhythms that, every so often, collide. The James Dean's Little Bastard Curse. In the autumn of 1955, Hollywood was at its golden height, a world of glamour, fame, and the shimmering illusion of immortality. Yet behind the studio lights and the carefully crafted smiles, there were lives that burned too brightly, too fast. Among them was James Dean, the restless young actor whose talent and intensity captured a generation's rebellion. He was 24 years old, rising toward stardom after his performances in East of Eden and Rebel Without a Cause. The world saw him as the embodiment of cool defiance, a symbol of youth itself. But beneath that image was a fascination with danger. Dean loved speed, and he loved cars. He once said that racing was the only time I feel whole. It was more than a hobby. It was his escape from the pressures of fame, the one place he could be himself, unmasked and unrestrained. And it was this passion that would lead him into one of the most haunting coincidences in modern history. In September 1955, Dean purchased a sleek, silver Porsche 550 Spider, a limited edition racing machine built for precision and power. The car was stunning. Small, aerodynamic, and blindingly fast. He nicknamed it Little Bastard, a phrase painted across its rear in bold letters. The name, half joking and half provocative, seemed to capture Dean's rebellious spirit, but some would later say it felt like a challenge to fate itself. On September 30th, 1955, Dean planned to drive the Spider to a race in Salinas, California. His mechanic and friend, Rolf Wutherich, rode beside him. They started early, heading north along U.S. Route 466. Along the way, several people who saw the car later recalled strange encounters. Actor Alec Guinness, whom Dean met just a week earlier outside a Los Angeles restaurant, had reportedly warned him, saying quietly, "If you get in that car, you'll be found dead in it within a week." Dean laughed it off. At 5:45 p.m., outside the small town of Shalem, a Ford Tudor driven by a 23-year-old college student named Donald Turnipseed turned left across the highway, directly into the path of Dean's speeding Porsche. There was no time to react. The impact was devastating. The Porsche was crushed almost flat, hurled into the air, and came to rest in a twisted heap of silver and steel. James Dean was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Wutherich survived, severely injured. Turnipseed escaped with minor cuts and bruises. News of Dean's death spread across the world overnight. It shocked fans, friends, and filmmakers alike. The image of the young, reckless actor, the man who seemed untouchable, had been extinguished in an instant. The tragedy became legend almost immediately. But what followed after his death would turn that legend into something darker, something that seemed to defy logic. The strange and eerie coincidences surrounding Little Bastard itself. After the crash, the wrecked Porsche was purchased by George Barris, a Hollywood custom car designer. Barris intended to use it for parts or as a safety exhibit to warn about speeding. But almost immediately, strange accidents began to occur. As the Spider was being unloaded at Barris's garage, it slipped off its trailer and broke a mechanic's leg. Later, when the car was sold for parts, the curse appeared to follow each piece that was removed. The engine was bought by two amateur racers, Troy McHenry and William Eschrod, who installed components from Dean's car into their own vehicles. During their next race, both men lost control on the same turn. McHenry was killed when his car struck a tree. Eschrod survived with serious injuries. The driveshaft from Little Bastard was later sold to another driver. His car too crashed, though he survived. Even the tires from Dean's Porsche reportedly burst simultaneously on another car, causing it to swerve off the road. As word of these incidents spread, people began to whisper about a curse. Newspapers picked up the story, weaving it into the growing mythology of James Dean, the actor who lived fast, died young, and whose spirit seemed to linger in the machine that killed him. Barris eventually loaned the wrecked remains to the California Highway Patrol, which used it in traveling safety exhibits. But even in that context, misfortune followed. In 1959, the garage where the car was stored caught fire. The Spider was damaged but not destroyed. Later, during transport to another exhibit, the truck carrying the car skidded and overturned. The driver was killed, and the car disappeared from the crash site. After that, Little Bastard was never seen again. Some claimed it had been stolen, others that it was hidden or dismantled. Decades later, collectors and historians still search for its remains, drawn by the eerie coincidence of its history. Each rumor only deepens the sense that the car itself had become a symbol, not of evil or magic, but of the strange, lingering echo of tragedy. Rational minds have long dismissed the curse as coincidence. Parts reused in dangerous races, superstitions amplified by media, and the natural pattern of accidents that occur around risk and speed. But for those who have studied Dean's short life, the coincidences remain unsettling. How could so many misfortunes trace back to one small car? How could a casual warning from a fellow actor seem so prophetic? Even the very name, Little Bastard, seemed to foreshadow the trouble that followed. James Dean's death marked a turning point in American culture. He became a myth, the eternal youth, frozen in time, untouched by aging or decay. His image, with that haunted stare and defiant posture, became an icon of the 20th century. But behind that image lies a quieter truth, that the story of his car, its journey after his death, and the accidents that followed speak to something deeper about chance, energy, and the weight of coincidence. Whether one believes in curses or not, the history of Little Bastard feels like a mirror reflecting the fragility of human control. Machines, speed, fame, all the things that make people feel invincible, can turn in an instant. The story endures not because it's supernatural, but because it reminds us how thin the line is between life and legend. Some say the Porsche was simply a victim of its circumstances, a fast car in dangerous hands. Others, more quietly, still wonder if objects can somehow absorb energy from the events that surround them. Either way, Little Bastard remains one of history's strangest coincidences, a symbol of how tragedy can echo through time, attaching itself to the physical world like an imprint. In the end, what began as a young man's love for racing became a story whispered for generations, of warnings ignored, fates intertwined, and a silver car that seemed to carry death wherever it went. Perhaps, as James Dean once said, "Dream as if you'll live forever. Live as if you'll die today." For him, those words became prophecy, and for history, another reminder that coincidence often walks hand in hand with destiny. The 1979 solar eclipse and the Mount St. Helens eruption. In the final winter of the 1970s, the Pacific Northwest lay beneath a shroud of cloud and quiet. The forests of Washington were still, the mountains coated with deep snow, and the people of the region carried on with their ordinary lives, unaware that two extraordinary cosmic events were about to unfold, bound together by coincidence in a way that still stirs awe and unease. One came from the heavens, a celestial alignment that darkened the world for minutes. The other came from the earth itself, a violent awakening after more than a century of silence. On February 26, 1979, a total solar eclipse swept across North America. For a few precious minutes, day turned into twilight as the moon perfectly crossed the face of the sun. The path of totality stretched from Oregon across Washington, Idaho, and into Canada, a narrow shadow racing at nearly 2,000 miles per hour. For astronomers, it was a rare opportunity to study the sun's corona. For millions of ordinary people, it was a moment of quiet wonder. Across the Pacific Northwest, towns fell still as the sky dimmed to an eerie blue-gray. Birds went silent. Temperatures dropped. In Portland and Yakima, crowds gathered in open fields, gazing upward through darkened lenses. Cameras clicked. Children gasped. For those few minutes, it felt as if time itself had paused. Unbeknownst to the watchers, only a short distance away, a sleeping giant was stirring beneath the earth. Mount St. Helens, the symmetrical volcanic peak rising over 9,600 feet above the forests of Washington. It had been dormant for more than a century. Native legends spoke of it as Lawalacloth, the Smoking Mountain, a name that carried both reverence and warning. Scientists considered it inactive. But within months of the eclipse, that assumption would vanish in a column of ash and fire. On March 20, 1980, just over a year after the eclipse, a series of small earthquakes began to rattle the area around Mount St. Helens. At first, they were dismissed as ordinary tremors. But within days, the quakes intensified, dozens per hour, then hundreds. By the end of March, the mountain's snow-covered summit began to bulge and crack. Steam vents appeared along its ridges. Something ancient was waking. The U.S. Geological Survey dispatched teams of volcanologists to monitor the site. Among them was David Johnston, a young scientist known for his calm dedication and curiosity. He set up instruments around the volcano, measuring gas emissions and seismic activity. His reports grew increasingly urgent. The mountain was not just active, it was pressurizing, its northern slope swelling outward at a rate of 5 feet per day. Beneath the surface, magma was forcing its way upward, reshaping the earth. And then came the eerie reflection, a coincidence that historians and locals would later connect with awe. The exact path of totality of the 1979 solar eclipse, that narrow band of shadow where the moon had completely covered the sun, passed directly over Mount St. Helens. The same mountain that would erupt a year later had stood beneath the darkest point of that celestial alignment, as if momentarily marked by the cosmos. At the time, no one noticed. The connection was made only after the eruption, when maps of the eclipse's path were compared with geological surveys. The alignment was uncanny. The line of total darkness had crossed precisely over the volcano's peak. To some, it was nothing more than coincidence, a random overlap between cosmic and earthly cycles. To others, it felt symbolic, as if the mountain had been chosen, its slumber punctuated by a shadow from the heavens. On May 18, 1980, at 8:32 a.m., the mountain finally exploded. A massive earthquake triggered a landslide on its northern face, the largest in recorded history, releasing the pressure that had built beneath it. The result was a catastrophic lateral blast that flattened hundreds of square miles of forest in seconds. The sky darkened as ash rose more than 15 miles high. Lightning flashed within the column of smoke, creating its own storm. The roar of the eruption was heard as far away as Montana. David Johnston, stationed 6 miles from the summit at his observation post, radioed his final message. "Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it." Moments later, his camp was engulfed by the blast. His body was never found. The eruption killed 57 people, destroyed thousands of homes, and forever altered the landscape of the Pacific Northwest. Rivers were choked with debris, forests were buried, and the once perfect cone of Mount St. Helens was replaced by a massive crater nearly 2 miles wide. Yet from that destruction, new life began to emerge. Scientists studied how ecosystems rebuilt themselves from ash, and within years, wildflowers and trees began to return. Nature, it seemed, knew how to heal even its deepest wounds. But the coincidence between the solar eclipse and the eruption lingered in public imagination. Newspapers and broadcasters noted the eerie timing, how the mountain had lain in total darkness only a year before its awakening. Superstitious minds saw it as an omen, a celestial signal that something deep within the earth had responded to. Others dismissed it as chance, pointing out that both events were part of natural cycles, one cosmic, one geological, intersecting purely by probability. Yet, even for scientists, the symbolic resonance was difficult to ignore. It was as if the heavens and the earth had briefly aligned, light and shadow, silence and eruption. Two great forces operating on vastly different scales, converging in time and space. The eclipse had been a moment of awe, a peaceful reminder of cosmic beauty. The eruption, a violent reminder of earthly power. Together, they formed one of history's strangest juxtapositions. A coincidence that seemed to bridge sky and soil, the divine and the destructive. Today, visitors to the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument often stand at the overlook near Johnston Ridge, gazing into the vast crater left behind. On clear days, the view stretches to the horizon. It is a place of silence, renewal, and reflection. Few remember that, just 1 year before it erupted, the mountain stood under a total eclipse. Its slopes bathed in a darkness as brief as it was perfect. The story of the 1979 solar eclipse and the Mount St. Helens eruption reminds us how thin the boundary is between wonder and catastrophe. The same world that can bring stillness and beauty can also unleash unimaginable force. Whether the alignment of the sun, the moon, and the mountain was mere chance or something more, it stands as one of nature's most haunting coincidences. A reminder that both heaven and earth move according to rhythms far beyond human understanding. The Unwritten Book of George Orwell. In the final years of his life, George Orwell, born Eric Arthur Blair, lived on a small, windswept island off the coast of Scotland. Frail from illness, surrounded by sea mist and solitude, he spent his last days writing feverishly, as if he were in a race against time itself. The world knew him as the author of Animal Farm and 1984, 2 works that reshaped political thought and literature alike. But there was another story, one that he never wrote, though fragments of it lingered in his notes and in the memories of those who knew him. It has come to be known as the Unwritten Book. After the publication of 1984 in 1949, Orwell's health deteriorated rapidly. He was suffering from tuberculosis, a disease that was steadily consuming his lungs. Yet, even as his body weakened, his mind remained sharp, restless, and deeply concerned with humanity's future. The success of 1984 brought him fame, but Orwell never saw it as triumph. To him, the novel was not a prophecy. It was a warning, a desperate plea to prevent the world from falling into the totalitarian nightmare he had described. On the Isle of Jura, where he sought isolation and fresh air, Orwell filled notebook after notebook. He wrote letters, essays, and fragments of ideas, sketches of future novels he would never finish. Among these notes was the outline of a story that friends later recalled as strangely hopeful, a sharp contrast to the bleakness of 1984. This new work, it seemed, was meant to explore the restoration of truth, what happens after oppression, when people try to rebuild their sense of humanity and meaning. It was, in Orwell's words, to be about the survival of decency. But the manuscript was never found. What makes this story so haunting is not only the fact that the book was lost, but the series of odd coincidences surrounding its disappearance. Orwell was meticulous in his habits. He kept drafts, carbon copies, and private journals with care. Yet, when his belongings were examined after his death in January 1950, one notebook was missing. Not destroyed, not misfiled, simply gone. Years later, an old friend of Orwell's, publisher Fred Warburg, mentioned in a letter that Orwell had once spoken of a final book that would close the circle. An idea, he said, came to him in a dream. The book, according to Warburg, was to deal with a man emerging from tyranny and learning to live honestly again. It was meant to be, in Orwell's words, the other side of 1984. And then the strange coincidences began. First, a curious journal entry surfaced from 1947. Orwell had written, "A dream of writing a book that cannot be written, the truth too pure to survive the page." Critics often dismissed it as metaphorical, but those close to him swore he had described this dream vividly in conversation. A story that was forming in his mind but that, for reasons unknown, he believed he would never complete. The second coincidence came from a lost typewriter. Orwell's trusted typewriter, a black Remington Portable, was damaged in 1948 when his small cottage on Jura flooded during a violent storm. Dozens of his pages, early drafts, letters, and notes were washed into the sea. Some were later found, soaked and unreadable, scattered along the rocky shore. Among the missing papers, according to islanders who helped him salvage the debris, was a brown folder labeled "The Last Man in Europe," the original working title of 1984, and another marked only with a single word, "After." No one ever saw that folder again. Later still, in 1952, a researcher sorting through Orwell's papers in London came across a list of unfinished ideas. Number 4 on the list read, "Book about the aftermath of revolution, redemption, the return of kindness, perhaps written by someone who cannot tell the truth anymore." That simple line, written in Orwell's careful script, has since fascinated historians. Some interpret it as an abandoned draft. Others believe it was the outline of a spiritual counterpart to 1984, a story of moral awakening rather than control. But if Orwell ever began that manuscript, it has vanished without trace. Then there is the strangest twist of all. In June 1984, 34 years after Orwell's death, the same year that lent its name to his most famous work, an anonymous envelope arrived at the offices of the Times literary supplement in London. Inside was a single, yellowed sheet of paper, typed on an old machine. Contained a passage that read, "The truth will return not with fire, but with silence. When the voice of power breaks, the whisper of decency will remain." The note was unsigned. Forensic experts examined it, and though the typeface matched the model of Orwell's old Remington, there was no proof it came from his hand. Still, the phrasing, the rhythm, the moral tone felt unmistakably his. The editor kept it locked in a private archive, where it remains to this day. Was it a forgery, a tribute, or something more mysterious? A fragment of Orwell's lost work somehow resurfacing in the year that bore his novel's name? No one can say for certain, but the coincidence is uncanny enough that scholars still mention it in lectures and biographies, often with quiet astonishment. In the end, the unwritten book of George Orwell has become more than just a lost manuscript. It is a symbol of unfinished ideas, of humanity's perpetual search for truth, and of the fragile connection between a writer's imagination and the time in which he lives. Orwell's career was a constant struggle between truth and illusion, honesty and fear. That a man who dedicated his life to clarity should leave behind a mystery, a book that cannot be found, that may never have existed, feels strangely fitting. It is as if Orwell's final lesson was not written in ink but in absence itself. That sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones that remain unsaid. And so, the unwritten book endures not as a novel but as an echo, a reminder that behind every finished story, there is always one that slips away, just beyond the page, just out of reach. The Silent Twin Story. In the quiet town of Haverfordwest, Wales, Two identical twin girls were born on April 11, 1963. Their names were June and Jennifer Gibbons. At first glance, they appeared like any other twins, inseparable, curious, and full of life. But as they grew, it became clear that their bond was unlike anything ordinary. They shared not only the same face and voice but also something deeper, a secret language, a silent world that belonged to them alone. By the age of 3, June and Jennifer had stopped speaking to everyone except each other. They whispered in rapid, indecipherable sounds, a private tongue that blended bits of English with invented rhythm and syntax. Teachers and doctors tried to understand, but no one could penetrate their linguistic code. To outsiders, they were mute. To each other, they spoke constantly. Their silence puzzled psychologists for decades. It was not physical muteness. Their vocal cords were fine. It was something far more complex, a mutual withdrawal, as though the two sisters had sealed themselves inside a shared mind. When spoken to, they would freeze, motionless and expressionless, communicating only through fleeting glances. When alone, they moved with astonishing synchronization, standing, sitting, even turning their heads in perfect unison. The twins' condition deepened during childhood. Bullied for their quietness and for being the only black children in their school, they withdrew even further. At home, they spent hours writing in notebooks, entire novels and plays about love, fame, and tragedy. They dreamed of becoming writers, of being seen and understood. Yet their works remained unread. Psychologists began to call them the silent twins. Researchers from the National Health Service studied them through the 1970s, trying to understand whether their silence was a psychological defense, a shared psychosis, or something entirely new. One researcher, Dr. John Rees, described meeting them as like entering a room with only one person, split into two bodies. Their home life was peaceful but isolating. They lived in near-total seclusion, often mirroring each other's every move. If June picked up a spoon, Jennifer did the same. If one refused to eat, the other followed. Over time, their synchronization turned darker. Each seemed to control and be controlled by the other. Journal entries discovered later revealed a growing tension between them. Jennifer once wrote, "There is a murderous bond between us. We are one. We are divided." As teenagers, the twins drifted into fantasy. They began to act out the stories they wrote, filming imaginary dramas and creating alternate worlds where they could exist freely. But reality eventually intruded. Their isolation led to frustration, and soon petty acts of vandalism began. Small fires, broken windows, shoplifting. These acts grew bolder over time, culminating in the arson of a local technical college. In 1981, at age 18, June and Jennifer were arrested and sentenced to indefinite detention at Broadmoor Hospital, one of Britain's most secure psychiatric institutions, a place once home to the criminally insane. For two young women whose crime had harmed no one, the sentence seemed severe. But psychiatrists were uncertain how else to treat them. At Broadmoor, the twins' silence persisted. They refused to speak to doctors, nurses, or even other patients. Their only communication remained with each other, often through whispers in their invented language. Staff began to notice a disturbing pattern. When one sister was active, the other would fall into a kind of trance, motionless for hours. Their lives appeared to operate in perfect opposition, as if their identities could not coexist fully at the same time. Then came a turning point, and one of history's strangest coincidences. In 1993, after more than a decade in confinement, doctors decided the twins had improved enough to be transferred to a lower security clinic. Just days before the move, Jennifer began telling staff that she felt something bad was about to happen. She spoke quietly to June and told her, "I'm going to have to die." June protested, confused. Jennifer only smiled and said, "You'll be free." On the day of their transfer, as they sat together in the van, Jennifer suddenly slumped against her sister's shoulder. Within minutes, she stopped breathing. By the time they reached the new hospital, she was gone. The cause of death was acute myocarditis, inflammation of the heart, but there was no trace of drugs, poison, or trauma. Her heart had simply stopped. She was 29 years old. After Jennifer's death, something extraordinary happened. June, who had been silent for nearly her entire life, began to speak. Clearly, calmly, she talked to nurses, doctors, and journalists. Her voice, though quiet, was steady. When asked why she and Jennifer had made the pact, she said only, "We had decided that one of us had to die so the other could live." It was as though, in losing her twin, June had regained herself. She was released from the hospital within a few years and went on to live a quiet life near her family. In interviews, she often spoke fondly of Jennifer, not as a haunting presence, but as a part of her that had finally found peace. "We were one," she said. "But now I am free." The mystery of the silent twins has fascinated psychologists and writers for decades. Was their bond a case of shared psychosis known as folie à deux? Or something even deeper, an extreme expression of twin connection that defies medical explanation? No scientific study has ever fully unraveled it. Yet what makes their story so haunting is not only the psychological enigma but the chain of coincidences surrounding Jennifer's death, her premonition, her calm acceptance, and the silent transformation that followed. Two lives, bound so tightly together that one could not continue without release. Today, June Gibbons lives quietly in Wales. She rarely speaks of the past. Her notebooks and Jennifer's writings are preserved in archives, their words filled with longing for understanding and for freedom. The story of the silent twins is not merely one of tragedy or illness. It is a profound reflection on identity, connection, and the fragile boundary between unity and isolation. In a world that demands individuality, they created one of their own, two voices that spoke as one until silence divided them. And perhaps, in that silence, they found what they had been searching for all along. A way to exist, at last, apart, but not alone. The Russian Tsar coincidence. In the long and turbulent history of Russia, fate has often played a hand that feels almost deliberate. A chain of moments so precisely mirrored across generations that historians still struggle to call them mere chance. Among these strange reflections, one stands above all. The coincidences surrounding the Romanov Tsars, their rise, their fall, and the eerie symmetry between the beginning and the end of the imperial line. The story begins in 1613, when a 16-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov was chosen to become Tsar of Russia. His coronation marked the end of the time of troubles, a decade of famine, rebellion, and foreign invasion. His rule brought stability, beginning a dynasty that would govern for more than 3 centuries. Yet the Romanov reign began, fittingly, with an act of survival chosen by chance from chaos. 305 years later, in 1918, another Romanov, Nicholas II, the last Tsar, would face his own moment of crisis. And this time, the family's story would end where it began. In isolation, uncertainty, and the shadow of fate. Historians have long noted the haunting parallels between Mikhail I and Nicholas II, two rulers separated by centuries but bound by circumstances that mirrored each other with uncanny precision. Mikhail's father, Patriarch Filaret, was imprisoned during his youth, leaving him a powerless figurehead until his father's release restored his authority. Nicholas, too, ruled under the powerful influence of his wife, Alexandria, and the mystic Rasputin, both figures whose presence weakened his political independence and sealed his downfall. But the coincidences run deeper than symbolism. When Mikhail Romanov was crowned in 1613, he did so reluctantly. He had been hiding with his mother in the remote Ipatiev monastery near Kostroma, fearful of the chaos that still gripped Russia. Messengers from Moscow found him there and begged him to accept the crown. At first, he refused, weeping as he claimed he was unworthy. Only after the clergy persuaded him that it was his divine destiny did he agree. In July 1918, more than 3 centuries later, Nicholas II and his family were taken to a house in Ekaterinburg, a house that had once belonged to a merchant named Nikolai Ipatiev. It was there, in the basement of that home, that the Romanov dynasty came to its violent end. The first Tsar was found in a monastery called Ipatiev. The last Tsar was executed in a house of the same name. No connection existed between the two places other than their names. Yet the symmetry is undeniable. A name that marked the Romanovs' rise also marked their fall. To those who lived through it, the coincidence was chilling. Even Bolshevik guards at the Ekaterinburg house reportedly whispered about the omen. The same word, iperative, had once meant salvation. Now it meant extinction. After the revolution, the house was destroyed by Soviet order in 1977, under direct instruction from Moscow, as if to erase the echo of that coincidence. But history, once written, cannot truly be erased. Another layer of strangeness lies in the dates. Nicholas II was born in 1868 and executed in 1918, exactly 250 years after the Romanov dynasty began. The first Romanov ruled for 32 years. Nicholas reigned for 23. Both ascended the throne during national unrest. Both were seen as reluctant leaders, and both believed their power was divinely ordained. Even the omens surrounding their reigns carried uncanny resemblances. When Mikhail accepted the throne, witnesses recorded that a solar halo, a circle of light, appeared in the sky, which the clergy interpreted as a sign of divine favor. In the days before Nicholas II's abdication in 1917, residents of Petrograd reported a red aurora blazing across the sky, an atmospheric phenomenon that many took as a symbol of blood and revolution. Two rulers, one crowned under light, one dethroned under fire. But the coincidences did not end with their deaths. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized both Mikhail Romanov and Nicholas II as saints, the first and the last Tsars, forever linked in the spiritual history of Russia. Their portraits now hang in the same cathedrals, their feast days observed within weeks of each other. Between them stretches the entire story of Imperial Russia, 3 centuries of triumph, tragedy, and transformation, perfectly framed by two men whose lives began and ended under the same signs. And then there is the strange, final twist, the one that historians rarely mention. When the Romanovs were buried in 1998, on the 80th anniversary of their execution, their remains were interred in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the same resting place as their ancestors. During the ceremony, a single candle at the altar reportedly went out just as the patriarch spoke the words, "The circle is closed." The phrase carried more meaning than it seemed, because in truth, the story of the Romanovs had begun with a circle, the halo that appeared over Moscow at Mikhail's coronation, and it ended with another, extinguished in darkness. Whether one sees these moments as divine messages or pure coincidence depends on belief. Yet, the symmetry of their fates, from the Iperative monastery to the Iperative house, from coronation light to revolutionary fire, is impossible to ignore. It is as though history itself had folded upon itself, tracing a perfect loop across centuries, returning to the same name, the same word, the same fate. The Romanov dynasty, which began in a sanctuary, ended in a prison. The first Tsar accepted power to save his people. The last was destroyed by it. 2 lives separated by time, yet bound by an invisible thread. A coincidence so complete that even the most skeptical historians admit its quiet poetry. Today, visitors to Ekaterinburg stand before the church on the blood, built on the site of the Iperative house. Bells ring softly in the distance. The air is still. Few tourists notice that nearby, engraved in stone, are the dates 1613 and 1918, the beginning and the end. Between them lies the echo of one of history's strangest coincidences. Not a prophecy, not a miracle, but something in between. A reminder that in the long arc of time, beginnings and endings often meet in the same place. Ending. History is full of strange patterns, moments that repeat, connect, and remind us how fragile and mysterious our world can be. Each of these coincidences tells us one simple truth. Sometimes, chance shapes destiny. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden connections, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and send this video to a friend who loves stories that make you think. Don't forget to subscribe. There are many more mysteries waiting to be told.